Okay, all set.
So welcome to the third online event of the Glasgow Anthropology Network. Today we are honored to have with us Professor Tim Ingold, who agreed to answer questions from my colleagues, Robert Gibb, Philip Turner, and myself. One of the most influential voices in British anthropology, Tim Ingold is the author of many publications which often cross conventional disciplinary boundaries and attempt to rethink anthropology as a scholarly project. So we came up with the idea of this interview after reading Tim's recent book, Anthropology, Why It Matters. And that, I think, is indeed a very complex and important question today. So thanks, Tim, for being with us. And first of all, again, how are you doing? And how are you coping with the lockdown?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and coping very easily because for me, I'm already used to, I retired in 2018 and I've got quite used to working at home. And so I have a routine and with all my travels and engagements cancelled for the last month and for the future, I'm trying to make the most of the opportunity that has opened up to think, read, write, and play the cello. So we're muddling along with my wife quietly at home, and we're well, thank you very much. And I hope everybody else is well too, and their families and friends.
Thank you. So can you all see Tim in the screen when he speaks, right? Right, perfect. So Tim, our first question is really what prompted you to write Anthropology, Why It Matters?
The immediate prompt was from the Polity Press. Pascal Pocheron, an editor at Polity, had come up with the idea of a new series of books, very short books, for every discipline in the humanities, to introduce that particular subject to a general audience. And so he wanted to do one for anthropology. And there are similar books for history, geography, theology, all sorts. Some have come out and others are on their way out. And I'd always kind of wanted to write a book like that. So I was very happy to take up the challenge. And it was quite interesting because Pascal, the editor, was a little bit unclear about the purpose of the book. On the one hand, the idea was that this would be a book that school children, school leavers, wondering what subject to take in university, it would be a book they would read to give them a taste of what the discipline is like and whether that's something they would like to study. But on the other hand, he was thinking of this series of books as part of the fight back of the humanities. But a way in which across all the disciplines of the humanities, we could reassert our importance in the contemporary world. And the difficulty was that these two objectives are quite difficult to match up. I mean, how do you write a book that is at the one hand a polemical advocacy of why your subject matters for the world and the future and for our thinking, and on the other hand, write a book that is informative for somebody who's not yet begun university study and is thinking about what to study. And at one stage, I was saying we can't actually do both these things. And the sort of book I want to write is the one that says why anthropology matters for everybody. And it was partly because of these discussions that this subtitle, Why It Matters, became. There were some other alternatives were considered. At one stage, for example, Why Study Anthropology was considered. And I said, I am not going to write a book called Why Study Anthropology, because that's the sort of thing that somebody might just take up. It's almost like teach yourself anthropology. It's like selling the discipline. I don't want to do that. I want to show why it matters for everybody. So that's the book I wanted to write, and that was the immediate prompt to write it. I suppose also because I have a rather passionate feeling that, well, that anthropology has been really very bad at managing its public image. It's one of the things we've failed at, rather, and we know we've failed because out there amongst the public at large, most people have a completely misplaced view about what anthropology is, what it does, and why it's important. So clearly we need to do our job differently. And it seemed to me that there are aspects of the way we present ourselves as anthropologists that has made it more difficult rather than less to get across to others what we actually do. And so I wanted to write a book that would present more coherently what anthropology is and why it matters in a way that would correct those public misunderstandings of the discipline. And I found that in order to do that, you had to correct quite a lot of misunderstandings that exist within the discipline as well. So I ended up writing a book that in many ways is quite critical of a lot of contemporary anthropology and the way it presents itself. And I wanted to do that. Okay. No, I'm not hearing.
You seem to be muted.
Philip, please, you can go ahead.
Yep, okay. So, Tim, you've defined anthropology as both philosophy with the people in and as a sustained and disciplined inquiry into the conditions and potentials of human life. You have described yourself as just an anthropologist, not a social or cultural, archaeological or biological anthropologist. And you've argued that anthropology stands with philosophy and some other disciplines against the territorialization of knowledge. Anthropology offers a different way of relating to the world, together with the promise to understand humanity within the total nexus of environmental relations. Given this, I'd like to ask you the following two questions. I'll ask you the first one and then...
Yeah, okay.
Can you expand on your view of the complex relationship between philosophy and as anthropology, or anthropology and as philosophy?
Yeah, I can. I have a very ambivalent attitude to philosophy. My feeling is that anthropology can do philosophy better than the philosophers can, and the reason we can do it better than the philosophers is that we have that the philosophers are hampered, are hamstrung, constrained by what they call the canon. That if you're a philosopher and you're carrying on some arguments and debate about an issue, you can only do it by placing it in the context of debates that are focused around canonical figures in the discipline. Could be anybody from Aristotle to Nietzsche, never mind who it is. But there's this long lineage of great thinkers, mostly white, mostly men, mostly dead, around which you have to focus your arguments. And that's been difficult for philosophy, firstly because it's restricted the range of ideas that it has access to, and also because it's tended to make philosophy rather introverted, in the sense that if you have to refer everything to the canon, then in a way you're excluding from the conversation everybody who's not directly familiar with it, all the people who are not professional philosophers or students of philosophy. And the great advantage that anthropology has is that it will talk to anybody. We take the view that whoever you're talking to in any part of the world, with any sort of background, from any walk of life, at any time in history for that matter, that what they say might be interesting, might be useful, might be something from which we can learn. And now in anthropology, it's not just people either. You could learn from non-humans, you can learn from animals, you can learn from plants, you can learn simply from paying attention to the world around us. And so that's why I came up with this formulation of anthropology as philosophy with the people in. What I meant by that is that all these people who are not on the canon of the discipline of philosophy, they're all people that we can be doing our philosophy with, having conversations with and learning from. And now I would enlarge that, in fact, somehow anthropology with philosophy with the people in seems a bit restrictive. It should be people and everything else as well in. And I want to try and, so the philosophy that I've been trying to do is a way of thinking that emerges out of talking with, wondering about, observing, paying attention to everything and anything we find in the world around us, rather than hiding in a library with volumes of Husserl or Heidegger or Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or whatever it is, trying to make sense of what these guys were saying. And I still think that that's really what the mission of anthropology is, that the questions that we're asking in anthropology are questions about, you know, how do human beings perceive, learn, remember, how do they exercise power, how do they organize themselves into collectivities, how do they deal with death and birth, and all these are basically philosophical questions. So the questions we're asking are philosophical, but the way we tackle them is by bringing in interlocutors from wherever we choose to find them. And anthropologists go to different places to work. They're finding their different interlocutors. And crucially, it's a thing we'll come to later, but that also includes students as well, the students that we work with. So I think that's where anthropology can do better philosophy than the philosophers. We do our thinking in the world, and we make that thinking accessible. Because the other thing that I really get fed up with philosophy is that philosophers have made very little effort to make what they say accessible to non-philosophers. Whenever I worry that I'm becoming too much of a philosopher, I think all I have to do is to read a philosophy book, and I know I'm all right. Because you read a philosophy book and you think, what is this person going on about? And they're tangling them around your fingers, and after a while you can't actually debate with them because you're already completely lost. And my experience of engaging with philosophy is that I've only understood what a philosopher is saying when I've already worked it out for myself. I've already, through my own thinking, have got to a point where I've sort of roughly converged with what some particular philosopher is saying. And then I can read this philosopher's book and say, now I understand what you mean. And maybe then the philosopher will help me get a little bit further. But what I can't do is to start with a philosophy book from a blank slate and understand anything of what they're talking about. You can only make sense of it once you're already on the same wavelength as they are. And that for me is a deficiency with a lot of philosophy. Sometimes they do seem to be a bit behind the times, I mean, for example, just recently we've come across all this stuff about object-oriented ontology and new materialism and so on, and you have these philosophers going around us. So they've made this amazing new discovery, and that is that things in the world can exist for one another, maybe hold meanings for one another, without there being any humans around at all. You know, the rain might mean something for the flower, you know, even if there weren't any humans. And they say this is amazing. This completely overturns philosophy. And you think, where have these people been? You know, what are ecologists and geomorphologists and soil scientists and everybody else been studying for hundreds and hundreds of years, the relations between plants and weather and so on. And you know, suddenly along come the philosophers who say, oh, you know, this is radical. We don't have to have humans there at all. And which was common sense for the rest of the world and always has been. And so you sometimes wonder about philosophers, how much of philosophy is really just trying to sort out problems of their own invention. You know, like we read Heidegger, and it turns out that really The problem for Heidegger is that he's a philosopher, but he would really like to be a peasant farmer, and he can't be both at once, and that's his problem. And all his philosophy stems from that. Or maybe that's a bit unfair, but you sometimes think that the philosophers are the source of their own problems in that way. Anyway, that's how I think about it, and so I, in many ways, I think that what I'm doing is philosophy, but I think it's better for it's at least for me more productive and more satisfying philosophy than what I get if I pick up much writings by professional philosophers.
Great. Okay. So the second part, thank you for that, Tim. The second part of my question is, how do you understand and approach the aspects of anthropology that deal with the past tense of human life? That is, how do you understand archaeology and paleoanthropology within the context of your approach in general?
I mean, I've always been one of a rather small number of anthropologists, I think, who've always felt very close to archaeology, and in some ways, I'm quite happy to think of archaeology simply as part of anthropology, or not really to have a boundary between the two at all. But the thing is that in archaeology, there's a division, I think, within archaeology that's rather parallel to the division I find within anthropology, between anthropology and ethnography. In archaeology, there's a division between people who are really interested in reconstructing life in the past, in some place, sometime. How did people live? What was their everyday life like? What sorts of social organization did they have? What kind of symbolic structures? And they want to reconstruct it, and on the basis of whatever evidence they can find, come up with a convincing story as they can. But on the other hand, there are archaeologists who are almost doing as I'm talking about doing my philosophy in the world, there are archaeologists who are doing their thinking at the edge of a travel, who are finding the earth that they're digging, the landscapes that they're working in, as a source of wisdom, something that they can learn from, which is not telling them about how this particular group of people lived in the past, but it's part of a way of thinking, even philosophizing, about what is a human relationship with landscape, what is the human relationship with time, what is the meaning of life and death, of burial, and all these big questions. And so I find that the really exciting link, or not even link, but almost identity between anthropology and archaeology is at that level, where we're talking about these questions, about landscape, about time, about meaning, whatever, in a broad way, and in which the archaeologists' interlocutors are the earth and the soil and the landscapes that they get to know very intimately through the sort of work they do. And that's the way I see the connection. Just as there's also a connection between ethnography in the rather classical sense of describing the life of another people in the past, and those sorts of archaeological reconstructions of telling a story about people who lived then. So I think that the division is parallel in both disciplines, if you get me. But the archaeology that really excites me is the sort of archaeology which is sort of a bit theoretical. But theoretical not in the sense of processing data, but theoretical in the sense of deep thinking about human relationships with the world over the long term. Yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give on that one.
Thank you, Tim. Diego, you're still muted.
In Anthropology, Why It Matters, you describe participant observation as a way of studying with people, rather than simply studying people. Participant observation is not viewed primarily as a method, but as a long-term commitment to learning by doing, and specifically by doing with others. Why should we think about participant observation in this way? And could you give me a concrete, could you explicate your view with a concrete example?
The answer to the first question is, it comes down to this issue that I mentioned a moment ago, responding to Philip, about the difference between anthropology and ethnography. And it's not that I think that anthropology is good and ethnography is bad, but I do think that they have different objectives. And I just had to explain that difference before I can answer your question. I mean, there is one objective, which is to describe and maybe analyze the way of life for a particular people in a particular place in a particular time. That's one objective, and that's an ethnographic objective, to give a description of the life of a people. There's another thing, which is to explore the conditions, and through a speculative comparative inquiry into what are the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world. And that's a different sort of thing, and I think that's what anthropology is really about. I've called it a long definition, is that anthropology is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical exploration of the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world. That's different from studying how particular people are living at some place and some time. And what is particular about that sort of anthropological investigation is that it brings people in as participants in a conversation about these questions which concern all of us. The question which I started my book with, how should we live? And that's the big question. And we want to bring everybody into a collective discussion around this question, which everybody's got something to contribute. And that means that we have to listen to and take seriously what people are saying to us, just as we would if we were having a conversation with a colleague. We listen and we take seriously. We may agree, we may disagree, but we are at least listening to them. We're not treating what they say as evidence to be held against them, so to speak. So that you're listening to what people tell us, you're not listening to them for what it tells about them. And that's the crucial distinction. So that if you're doing participant observation, you are like an apprentice. You're learning, as an apprentice is learning from a master, you're learning from your conversations with the people that you're working with. And that means that you are learning from them and taking seriously what they're showing you and telling you, not simply in order to report back on them. I mean, many people have pointed out that the awkward double meaning of the word rapport. I mean, all anthropologists say, rapport is essential for participant observation, but rapport can mean both befriending people and also delivering a report on them. And there's a sort of a double-edged thing, that you make friends with people in order then to turn them into the objects of your investigation. And there's something very, very kind of unethical about that. My feeling is that actually, because a lot of my colleagues have said, why are you worrying about this distinction between anthropology and ethnography? What you're calling anthropology is all what we do anyway. When we go and do our field work, of course we listen to what people say, and of course we learn from them. And of course we're not putting ourselves above them, and of course we're not treating them as objects. And that's all fine. And most of the time, when anthropologists are in the field, they are doing exactly what I think anthropologists ought to do. They're having conversations, they're learning, they're being transformed, and the rest of it. But the problem is when they come back and they're told by the institutions of academia that what they've just been doing is gathering data, and that their job now is to process that data and turn it into an account. And that's the point at which the tables are turned, so to speak. And the people that you've been working with and respecting and listening to suddenly become objects of your investigation. And then in the textbooks, participant observation turns into a technique of data gathering. And your field notes, which are really a diary that you've written for yourself, turn into a body of data, you know, that's supposed to be archived for other researchers to use and so on. So that's why I think we have to resist that pressure, and the pressure, I think, is coming from the institutional structures of the academy, not necessarily from within anthropology itself. But as long as anthropology is positioned as an academic discipline, it's vulnerable to this pressure that comes from the academy that says, look, you're a researcher, so you're going to the field to gather data and you're supposed to analyze it and write it up and turn it into knowledge. And it's very hard for anthropology to resist that. And I think we sometimes give in a bit too easily. So that's, and perhaps the other point to mention is just that I don't see participation and observation as in any sense contradictory. I mean, many people have argued that how can you do both at the same time? It's like saying, how can you observe and participate at once? But my argument is that you can't actually, it's impossible to observe without participating. You can't observe anything without some sort of coupling between the observer and whatever is attracting that observer's interest. So there has to be participation behind it, which means that there's a difference between observation and objectification. And there's a point at which observation goes beyond the objectification of the world. And that point is precisely where the things you're studying in the world are beginning to tell you how to observe. Where people are saying, this is how you should observe us. Pay attention to what we're doing. And it's at that moment when, instead of us just observing the world begins to teach us how to observe, how to see, how to hear. That's when we get real participant observation, I think. And why, you know, we have to go beyond this idea of objectification in our research.
Thank you, Dean. That's a very interesting way of putting it. In the book, you describe anthropological fieldwork as a slow process of being educated by others, as you just beautifully put it. And you suggest also that this education is and should be transformative. Can you explain what types of transformations this process entails, and perhaps discuss your own transformative experiences? But could you also tell us how you think that anthropological education in academic settings can be a transformative experience for students?
Yeah, those big questions that it requires us to rethink what education is, for a start. I mean, I want to argue indeed that anthropology is fundamentally an educational enterprise. It's more educational than ethnographic, that we undergo an education in the field, we educate our students, we're all transformed in the process. But the first thing is that we have to, there's a big discussion about this in educational circles, where sometimes the distinction is made between a strong sense of education and a weak sense of education. And the strong sense of education is, I have a body of knowledge, authoritative knowledge, and I'm going to pass it down to you, the student, and that's my job. I will instill this knowledge. You're ignorant at the moment, I'm knowledgeable, I'm going to transmit this knowledge to you. That's the strong sense of education that is built in to most of our educational institutions. It's what we're supposed to be doing, the students in a university, and what we're judged by. And then there's a weak sense of education, which is in a sense just the opposite. It's saying, actually, I'm a teacher here, but I don't know anything. I've got no knowledge to pass on to you, but we're going to go on a journey together and we'll see what we'll find. And my role as a teacher is to be a generous guide and a critic of what you're doing. but I don't know the destination any more than you do, and we're going to work on this. We're going to work on this together. And there's an etymological basis for this, in that you can trace the word education either to the Latin educare, which means to instill authoritative knowledge, or more basically to ex ducere. Ducere is to lead and ex is out. So the education is a process of destabilizing, of leading people out of their established safe positions, moving them sideways, so to speak, so that the world looks different. It's a form of exposure, of taking people, not putting people in a position, but taking them out of it. And that's exactly what anthropology always does. It's a way of destabilizing our comfortable assumptions, of moving us out of comfortable positions, so that we then see things more directly. Things open up to us because we're not already surrounded by our knowledge defenses that have been established through formal education. So I want to argue that education is fundamentally about that, about leading out into the world, rather than instilling foregone knowledge. And in that sense, for anybody who's done anthropological fieldwork, they recognize that feeling very well. I mean, you go into the field and you have nothing to stand on, and it's all very destabilizing, and you have to find a way along with others. And you are being educated by the people that you're working with, and that is clearly transformative for you. In my own experience, that this transformation is something that you don't really realize has happened until long afterwards. So, I mean, I was doing my doctoral fieldwork amongst Sami people in northeastern Finland, and I was doing very standard kinds of things that I was told I ought to do, like connecting kinship diagrams and finding out about economic activities and the rest of it, collecting lots of material, which I wrote up in my thesis. But then later on, I was thinking, why is it that I'm drawn to particular ways of arguing, to particular sensibilities, to particular understandings of what it means to be in the world? And I think of all the possible reasons, the possible influences that predispose me to think in one way rather than another. And I keep coming back to that field experience. The stuff I learned from the people that I was with, I didn't even realize I was learning it. But I was a young man. I was still growing up, 22, 23, doing field work. You know, you don't yet know who you are. You're still forming some sort of sense of who you are. So all of that experience, which was very intense in a way, becomes part of a growing up process for you. And it's no wonder then that you come out a different kind of person after a year and a half of doing that. You come out a different kind of person that if you've been doing something else, if I'd been sitting in a library all that time, I would have turned into I would have grown up differently. So it's clearly that is transformative, but you don't realize what it's done to you until much later. That's what I found in my own experience. I think it's important to recognize that it's transformative for the people among your work as well. And that's what it makes it a bit more than just apprenticeship. I mean, it might be that if you're an apprentice, you learn a craft. The master craftsman you're working with, maybe he doesn't learn anything. He's just teaching you because he already knows. But if you're going to join in these kinds of conversations, anthropological conversations in a field setting, then you're only going to get real education going on if it's transformative for both parties, transformative both for the people and for the anthropologist. And I think that's important. And then the other thing, of course, is that exactly the same thing ought to be happening within the university when we're working with students. The students too, they're intelligent beings, they have experience to share. We have conversations with them. And I think it's a scandal how little we have been prepared to acknowledge that anthropology, how little we're prepared to acknowledge how much of our anthropological thinking we owe to our students and the conversations we have with them. Because most professional anthropologists, certainly my experience, I spent far more years of my life in a classroom with students as I ever have in the field. And I think that's probably true for most of us. And we now, it took some time, but we now recognize so what the people we used to call informants, we now recognize that they're collaborators, that they're interlocutors, that they're people we talk with, and that we owe a lot of our knowledge to them. But we still exclude students. And I really think we should level the playing field and stop saying that what's happening inside the institution with students or colleagues is radically different from what's happening outside the institution with people in the field. I don't see a clear boundary between one domain and the other. I don't think there should be one anyway.
Thank you, Tim. Robert.
Great. You concluded an article published last year called Art and Anthropology for a Sustainable World by writing the following: when big science collapses, as it is bound to do along with the global economy that sustains it, art and anthropology will be left to usher in the future. We must be ready for it. What can anthropology contribute now during the coronavirus pandemic? And how can we prepare ourselves so we're ready to make contributions at later stages of the pandemic?
Well, maybe I made myself a hostage to fortune in those words, but and they were a little bit rhetorical and even tongue-in-cheek, perhaps. But I still think that that big science is wedded to the program of neoliberal globalization, and pandemic or no pandemic, I mean, that this was already on the rocks, that everybody knew, even before anybody was talking about this virus, everybody knew that that neoliberalism had hit the buffers, or that if it was going to continue any further, it was manifestly unsustainable and would have consequences in terms of climate change and the growth of inequality across the globe that was simply couldn't be managed. So we were basically heading, before this pandemic came, we were all driving ourselves over a cliff anyway, but nobody had the power to stop it. So we were all caught up in this roller coaster that was just accelerating in speed all the time. And even before the pandemic struck, think of all the worries about the fires in Australia, about droughts, floods, and so on. We were already had this feeling that we're living on a knife edge. You think about the climate rebellion and the rest of it. That simply couldn't go on. So that pandemic or no pandemic, we are about to crash, and with that crash would go not only the global economy, but also the big science that both depends on it and supports it. And that's been my feeling for a long time, and I think many other people have thought the same way. And the positive spin you can put on the pandemic is to say that this pandemic is actually has saved us. It's forced us, because we are unable to do it ourselves. It's forced us to suddenly stop, to actually bring the curtains down on the economy. I mean, nothing else could have actually stopped the global economy in its tracks, but this has. And then everybody sits back and says, wait a moment, we couldn't go on like that, could we? And there are many, many voices saying that that we cannot go back to what was considered normal, because what was considered normal was simply not normal. It was just the opposite. So we have a moment now to reflect. It would be great if there wasn't so much human suffering behind it all, but unfortunately there is. But we do have a moment to reset. And then you think, well, who is going to do the resetting? Where are the ideas going to come from that will really make such a reset possible? And they're not going to come from disciplines such as economics, behavioral psychology, even mainstream biomedicine. But they're going to come from those subjects that have already been thinking deeply about the human condition. And those subjects include anthropology, philosophy, some other branches of the humanities maybe, some areas of science perhaps, but they've all been small and smothered by the big machine. And if this offers a possibility for this kind of deep thinking to come out from the shadows, and for people to pay attention in a way that they haven't before, and for these to become matters of public debate, which at the same time would mean, again, listening to and taking seriously the understandings and knowledge of people who've usually been written off around the world, then that would be a wonderful thing to come out of a tragic situation, I think. And so in that sense, anthropology must be ready. I think it carries a big burden, and it's really important that we do take the burden, and that we do not retreat into a very narrow ethnographic particularism, which is the temptation. That we are ambitious and open to the world. Yeah, I think that's the best way I can answer that one.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Okay, so my last question is, you were involved with the Reclaiming Our University movement at the University of Aberdeen, which produced a manifesto in 2016. The manifesto emphasised the need for rebuilding the university from its very foundations. And the coronavirus pandemic is already resulting in significant changes within universities in the UK and elsewhere. Online teaching, non-renewal of temporary contracts and so on. How can we act now to prevent a rebuilding of the university even more in line with the business route and ensure that it retains and develops its civic purpose, to borrow the distinction made in the manifesto?
Well, of course, I'm not sure. I don't know how to do it. And even before the pandemic, I mean, long before, many discussions I was having with people of this kind, and people would say, what can we do? How can we, because they could see that even pandemic or no pandemic, universities were heading for economic difficulties. In many universities, perhaps more in England than in Scotland, actually, they've taken off on massive debts from vanity building projects on these PPI initiatives, and then there's interest to be paid. And so there's going to come a time very soon, even without this pandemic, when the universities were going to be stuck in the situation that either they repay their debts or they keep their staff. They can't do both. And so we ended up, with these magnificent buildings without any staff to teach the students. All that would be done online and so on. So we were heading that way anyway. And the point is, then you could argue that the current crisis could either exacerbate the situation or hasten it, or make this position of unsustainability come sooner rather than later, or alternatively, we could set off in a completely different path. My guess is that a lot of institutions will try, and like Durham were trying to do just recently, get rid of half their staff, put everything online, try and survive in the competitive market. No doubt there'll be institutions that try to do that. And I think because the writing was already on the wall for them before the pandemic struck, I think that can be no more than sort of a holding off, you know, like trying to survive a few years more. It's like saying, well, oh, maybe I can, instead of dying at 90, I can hang on until I'm 95, you know, but they might buy a year or two or three or four, but they won't buy something that is in any sense sustainable. So we have, that's why I felt, again, even before the pandemic, that we have, we have two alternatives. Either we say, well, let the universities sink along with everything else, and then we'll start again. Or let's start thinking now about what the university of the future should be like, so we can start building it, and we have something already, a model already in place, so that when the existing structure falls, we have something there already thought through and worked out to put into motion. And in a way, I think the difference that this current crisis has simply made that it's more urgent. We just had to get on with it. It's no good moaning about the terrible things, way the universities are, and about the business model and the rest of it. Instead of moaning, we have to be sitting down and working out, well, if we're going to have universities in the future in a more sustainable kind of society, then what are they going to be? How are they going to be operated? What principles do they rest on? How are they going to be funded? We have to be thinking about all those questions now in a constructive way. We just, I think the pandemic has simply highlighted something that we need to be getting on with anyway. And if there's one thing I learned from the reclaiming movement, is that you won't get any assistance from people at the top. People in high places are only interested in telling everybody else how they're in high places and how important they are. I was quite amazed that when we were going through that movement, and I was trying to talk to people in the universities movements that might help us, and they said we actually haven't a clue what you should do, and we figured out the only way to generate change is, as we say, from the bottom up, you know, from people at the coalface responding to local conditions. Oh, and there's just one more thing I want to say about that, about the University of the Future, that I think it must be something, a University of the Future has to be one that is bedded, grounded in its own region, rather than tied to so-called international aspirations. We have this terrible ranking system, which more or less puts international distinction against a commitment to the region and the people who inhabit it. So that the higher you are, you know, the more you say, never mind about the bloody people. You know, they're just down there. We're interested in corporate. So we need to think of a university as somewhere that is a kind of that absorbs into its way of working the history, the lifeblood, the feeling of the region it's working in. And that would make every university different, as every region is different. And that way they could all contribute in their own way to the common good. That's the ideal I have, in which universities are really committed to the regions in which they find themselves. Not region as a bounded administrative entity, but region as a kind of living world for people who inhabit it.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That's such a fascinating concept, and which really concludes so well. Very interesting talk. I guess we will now open the floor for questions from the audience.